also ensures that the Council will be able to function effectively, and, sir, I commend it to the House.
Call Eugenie Sage.
Chair. Well, that's a very interesting explanation from one of the sponsors of the bill, even though it's not in his name, because I think that the recreational hunters in New Zealand and the Deerstalkers Association have been sold a pup with this amendment. If it is so anodyne, then why wasn't it brought to the Select Committee to consider? Why is it being pushed through under urgency? Because recreational hunters are being cut out of the bill through this SOP, because it removes the word recreational wherever it occurs. So that means that the Game Animal Council will only have to liaise with hunters and hunting organisations, not recreational hunting organisations such as the Deerstalkers Association. It means that when the Minister is appointing members of the Game Animal Council, he won't need to include anyone on the Game Animal Council who has knowledge or experience of recreational hunting. He only has to have somebody who has knowledge, more general knowledge of hunting. And the most fundamental change that this SOP brings in is that herds of special interest won't have to be managed for recreational hunting purposes. They will just have to be managed for hunting. So that means that the Game Animal Council potentially can manage these herds as a private recreational resource, not for the benefit of Kiwi hunters, but for well-heeled trophy hunters. And this is another example of government by the 1% for the 1%. Nick Smith should be ashamed of himself, given that he was on the Select Committee and he heard the passion of recreational hunters for their activity. This SOP cuts right across that. And it's interesting, isn't it, that instead of Mr Dunn relying on advice from the Department of Conservation as an independent public sector agency for what the clause means, is relying on Gary Ottman, who's got a very narrow sector interest in this and has been one of the major promoters of the bill. So what we're seeing here is the government, just as it penalised recreational fishers with its changes to the daily catch of snapper, is through this legislation penalising recreational hunters by cutting their voice out, by making sure that they don't have a seat at the table around the table for the Game Animal Council. And Mr Chair, why this is so dangerous is because the bill provides for the Game Animal Council to make recommendations to the Minister on how it's going to recover its costs to run this 11-member council. It allows the Minister then to make recommendations through Order in Council to set fees and levies. Now, the fees and levies that would be set for a hunter to be able to go hunting on Rakiura Stewart Island for white-tailed deer at the moment are about $30 as DOC covers its admin costs. If you've got the Game Animal Council with no recreational hunter representatives on it setting or recommending to the Minister the fees and levies for hunting whitetail if they become a herd of special interest, they may be in the thousands of dollars. Similarly with tar, unaffordable for Kiwi hunters. So that's why this SOP, we need much more explanation. We need it from the Department of Conservation, from officials, not from Gary Ottman, about what this SOP means. But my reading of it is, by stripping out those references to recreational, is that it will reduce the voice of recreational hunters. They won't have a seat at the table in the Game Animal Council. One of the other major concerns about the bill is the impact it will have on commercial deer recovery. And Damien O'Connor talked about the huge benefit that commercial venison recovery had in reducing deer numbers several decades ago. They shoot about 18,000 animals a year. They save the Department of Conservation several $1 million in pest control culling costs. And yet those operators made extensive submissions to the Select Committee about the potential impact that this bill would have on them because of the increasing intolerance that some sectors of the hunting community have towards waro operations and commercial recovery. Because at the moment, those waro operators are prohibited from being able to commercially recover deer and venison in recreational hunting areas, which cover about 187,000 hectares, and it's likely that the Game Animal Council won't want them to operate in any areas where you've got a herd of special interest designated. And so that, Mr Chair, will actually reduce the ability of those commercial operators like Highland Cuisine, thank you, Mr Chair, which put in quite a detailed submission explaining how it processes wild venison for export. It employs about 20 people directly and indirectly, and it said in its submission, we see the Game Animal Council with its potential costly bureaucracy as a direct threat and impact to our future business. The new bill will be costly in real terms and become a bureaucratic and environmental burden for hunters, businesses, taxpayers alike. And that's because the Highland Cuisine had noted that since the Game Animal Council Establishment Committee had been established, its suppliers, who are going out in those helicopters, shooting animals, recovering the venison, processing it and then exporting it to places like Germany, were seeing an increased intolerance of recreational hunters towards them. And so if the Game Animal Council, given its substantial powers over these areas to be designated as herds of special interest, will exclude those operators, and that will restrict the areas where they can recover animals. And it will restrict what the national government's on about a lot, added value processing. These operators take something that's a problem, a pest, and turn it into an export that's high value. So that whole business community is being disadvantaged by this bill. The other major concern we have is just around the fact that the bill doesn't exclude herds of special interest being established in our premier natural areas like our national parks. So that's why there's an SOP in my name to make sure that when the Minister decides whether or not to designate a herd of special interest, it cannot be in a national park. Because the Select Committee did make some useful changes to the criteria that the Minister would use when he was considering whether to designate a herd of special interest in Clause 16. It tightened that quite considerably and added criteria like the status of the land where the animals were to be found and the statutory requirements around that land. But it doesn't include a specific exclusion on these areas being established in national parks. And there have been problems with this in the past with the TAR plan. For a long time, the TAR hunters argued that there should be no culling of TAR in Aoraki Mount Cook National Park. This is despite the fact that national park legislation provides that exotic animals should be eradicated wherever feasible. But we had this hunting interest wanting to hunt TAR in the national park, strongly opposing TAR culling and TAR control. It was only over very strenuous efforts that it was finally recognised that the national park legislation should prevail. Similarly, if you don't have an explicit protection of national parks so that herds of special interest can't be established in them in the bill, we will see the Game Animal Council arguing against culling in national parks and opposing potentially 1080 drops, and certainly agree with the concerns that Damien O'Connor raised about the value of 1080 as a pest control tool. And while Mr Dunn can give the reassurances of Mr Ottman and others that they won't be opposing 1080, that has not been the history in the past. Because of the desirable by-kill of deer, hunters have opposed 1080. Doc's done a lot of work on deer repellents, and Mr Chair will come back to some other points later.
I'm going to call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Much, Mr Chairman. I'm very pleased to take a call on part